In this section, I'd like to introduce you to one of my favourite things in philosophy, the notion of a collective goal. Now, it's going to be a little bit hard to see why the notion of a collective goal is useful, so just bear with me. In the next section, I will put these to good use. So here we are, we're on a course where we want to combine philosophical, psychological and formalisable theories about action, and in this part about joint action. We spent some time thinking, with respect to joint action, about team reasoning and how that might help us to build philosophical theories of joint action, or not. For the next part of the course, I want to switch and think about how we might get a combination of philosophical and psychological theories. And as will become clear a bit later, not in this section but next one, the notion of a collective goal is fundamental for that end, just as the notion of a goal in the ordinary individual case was fundamental. Oh, that makes me think, you know what, let's just have a quick look at that notion of goal in the ordinary individual action. How spontaneous is that? So here you are, you're at a party, you're doing various things simultaneously. So you're lighting and smoking a cigarette, you're also opening a bottle and filling Zach's glass. So here's the interesting thing. There are actual and possible outcomes, and there is one of those in particular, the filling of Zach's glass, and it is the case that some of your actions collectively, not the actions here individually, but these as a group, are directed to bringing that outcome about. Now, it may occur or it may not occur, it may not be an actual outcome, but these actions collectively are directed to bringing that outcome about. So in this situation, we can say, what's the relation between the purpose of action and the outcome or outcomes to which it is directed? And we know that one way to answer this question, a very standard way to answer this question, is to appeal to a notion of intention. Because an intention is something that specifies a particular outcome. You intend that you fill Zach's glass. It provides for the coordination of your action. And when things go well, it provides for the coordination of your action in such a way that it's more likely to bring about the outcome that the intention specifies. So we start off with this kind of metaphorical notion of directedness. The purpose of action is somehow directed to the filling of the glass and not the soaking of Zach's trousers or anything like that. You're not trying to make someone freak out. We start off with this roughly metaphorical notion of directness, and then we fill in some details here. We make that precise by talking about a particular kind of state that might allow us to do that, namely the notion of intention. But what we saw earlier in the course is that it's not just intention that can perform this role. It's also possible that this role can be performed by motor representation. So an advantage of thinking about the structure of action in terms of the things that you do and the goals to which they're directed is it allows us to be open about the states and processes that link your actions to the outcomes. It allows us to consider multiple different possibilities by asking this question about what the relation between the purpose of action and the outcomes to which it's directed are. Now, there's another important thing that I take from this picture, which is that goals are something different from an intention. So in this picture, an outcome to which your action is directed is a goal. This is an actual or possible state of the world. An intention is a mental state in you, in virtue of which your action is directed to a goal. So it's clear that a goal and an intention must be something different. Otherwise, it couldn't be that. It was in virtue of the intention that your action was directed to the goal. The two things must be different. Now, of course, some philosophers use the term goal to mean a mental state of the agent, and that's just terminological. The important thing for us is that we don't get confused between the outcome to which an action is directed, I'm using the word goal for that, and the mental states such as intentions in virtue of which your action is so directed. Now, so that's our quick recap of what's happening in the individual case. What's happening in the joint case? What notion of goal might be useful here? Maybe the notion of a collective goal. Now, we've already done some work towards this because in an earlier section we have distinguished distributive from collective interpretations. That section is linked to below in case you need a quick reminder. But hopefully this will be enough to bring it back, save you flicking off. So if I have a sentence like the tiny drops fell from the bottle, that contrasts with the sentence like the tiny drops soaked Zach's trousers, because it is natural to read the first sentence distributively. The tiny drops falling is just a matter of each individual drop falling. And to read the second sentence collectively, the tiny drop soaking Zach's trousers isn't a matter of the first drop soaking Zach's trousers and then another one doing it, then another one doing it. Each of the drops really is kind of too tiny to have much of an effect. What happens here is that the tiny drops do that collectively. So I take it that the natural reading of the first sentence is different from the natural reading of the second sentence, and that difference is how the predicates work. In the first case they work distributively, in the second case they work collectively. Tiny bit of semantics here. A bit of semantics that turns out to be very useful if you're studying logic, by the way. Now, of course, it's possible to have collective reading of the first sentence and a distributive reading of the second sentence. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just suggesting that in most contexts, the intended interpretation is unlikely to be that each of the tiny drops individually soaked Zach's trousers, for example. Right? And then we have sentences like the thoughtless action soaked Zach's trousers, which can naturally be understood either way. So you remember this from the previous section. Now, the important thing here is that you know there's a genuine semantic ambiguity, because if you read this sentence distributively, Zach's trousers must have been soaked on at least 2 occasions, whereas if you interpret it collectively, you only need a single soaking of Zach's trousers for it to be true. So how many soakings the truth of the sentence requires depends on whether you interpret it collectively or distributively, and that shows that there's a genuine semantic ambiguity here, an alteration to the truth conditions of the sentence. Similarly, this sentence, the goal of their actions was to fill Zach's glass, the teleological counterpart of the causal sentence, can also be interpreted collectively. And I want to say here something very simple. When you have a sentence about the goal of some actions, and the actions are performed by 2 or more agents, and the sentence is true on the collective interpretation, then the outcome that the sentence specifies, the goal, is a collective goal of those agents' actions. So that's what I mean by a collective goal. It's something that's picked out by sentences about the actions of multiple agents, which identify an outcome to which their actions are directed, and that sentence is true on the collective reasoning. That's what it takes for there to be a collective goal. Now you might say, well look, Steve, how could we realise that? How could we realise that? What would be, give me some sufficient conditions. I like sufficient conditions. So here are some sufficient conditions. Suppose that you and I are doing some stuff close by to each other, and suppose that there is a single outcome, the filling of Zach's glass, such that first of all our actions are coordinated. So we're doing this carefully. I'm looking at you as you're tilting the glass. You're looking at me as I'm pouring the bottle. There's this important relational constraint because, as you know, if you've ever done this, the position of the bottle has to match the position of the glass. You can move the glass as long as I move the bottle and so on, right? In order to get the Prosecco into the glass, they've got to be tightly coordinated. Furthermore, the type of coordination that we're currently engaged in is something that would normally increase the probability of Zach's glass being filled. Where that's true, I want to say, then our actions are directed to this outcome, the filling of Zach's glass, and that isn't only, thanks to the element of coordination, a matter of each of our actions individually being directed to the outcome. So I'm saying here we have sufficient conditions for our actions to have a collective goal. I'm not saying that there's some kind of necessity. I don't know whether collective goals always involve coordination in this way or not, because I identified them by appeal to the idea that there are true sentences about goals which are true on a collective interpretation. But I know that I can make sentences true on the collective interpretation by fulfilling these conditions, so I know that there's sufficient conditions for there to be a collective goal. So we understand what collective goals are. They're outcomes to which 2 or more agents' actions are directed, where this isn't only a matter of each of the agents' actions being directed to that outcome. Very simple. So this notion of a collective goal is for joint action, the counterpart of the notion of a goal for ordinary individual action. Now, what you might remember is that when we were thinking about ordinary individual action, a lot of the philosophical theories relied on the notion of intention, but we were maybe able to make quite good progress in understanding action by thinking first about goals and only fitting intentions into the picture much later. What you've seen if you've been following along is that when philosophers are thinking about joint action, they're also mostly thinking about a counterpart to intention that we've been calling shared intention. So whatever intention's counterpart is for joint action, shared intention, they're starting there. It's possible that we will make progress by thinking about, not about the joint counterpart of intention, the shared intention, but rather the joint counterpart of the goal, the notion of a collective goal. And that doing this will allow us to provide a way to integrate insights from the psychological research that would be unavailable to us if we insisted on sticking to the standard philosophical story about shared intention. So how would that go? Well, once we've got the notion of the collective goal in view, we can ask a question that's exactly analogous to a question that was useful in the individual case. We can say, look, in virtue of what could two or more agents' actions have a collective goal? And in asking that question, we're moving away from the earlier question, what distinguishes the genuine joint actions from parallel but merely individual actions? So I take this to be the question that organises nearly all of the philosophers' thinking about joint action. But I think that there is a more basic and still interesting question that we should answer first. I also want to suggest that doing this is helpful to us because it allows us to separate two kinds of project. One is characterising the thing that is to be explained, and the other is identifying the thing that explains it. So what we've got here is the notion of a collective goal, and I explained the notion of a collective goal to you without talking about anything in virtue of which actions have collective goals. So what is a collective goal is a clearly separate question from in virtue of what do agents have collective goals. This here is a question about the nature of the actions, and this here is a question about representations, processes, or other sorts of mechanism. What you'll notice if you think about the way that accounts of shared intention that involve team reasoning, or Michael Bratman's account of shared intention, or other accounts of shared intention, is that they generally put the two projects together. So they try to tell you what the thing is, what joint action is, by talking about the things in virtue of which there is joint action, by talking about the team reasoning process or about the shared intention, that structure of states. This approach here, thinking about things in terms of collective goals, has a useful advantage if we want to draw on some psychological research. The advantage is that we can clearly separate the thing to be explained from the thing which explains it. So let's see how that goes.